Hello, I'm going to be going over my Finansify web application that I built using React. Let's start off by going over the root of the project, app.js. Over here, I'm going to be opening a brand new incognito tab in order to have this application open up from the beginning. Okay, so in my app.js, the very first thing I see is I configured my Redux store, and then I set up a JSX to rendering the provider and app router. Underneath that, I have a hasRendered variable that I use to render my application only after I call it when I check if there has been any kind of change in the authentication state. Meanwhile, while that is being checked, it does render a loading page, which renders a GIF of a loading bar. So it renders loading page, and then the app gets rendered once it checks for the user. Next up, let's go look at our app router. Here, I have a few different types of routing, a public route and a private route. The reason for this is because I need here, a public route does make sure that the login page is always seen, and the private route makes sure that the route is only seen if you are logged in. Now, let's take a look at that real fast. So let's take public route here. We can see that it checks if it's authenticated, and if so, it redirects to the dashboard. Otherwise, it just renders a component. That's for the public one, allowing for the component to render either way. If I look at the private route, we'll see here that it checks if it's authenticated, and if it is, it renders a header and our component. Otherwise, it redirects to our login page. And now, let's go look at exactly that, our login page. So here, as we see here on the left of the screen, we have a background image, we have a little bit of text, and just a single button to log in using Google Authenticator. Here we have in our code our button using onClick Start Login, which if we go to our Actions auth file, wrong file. There we go, auth, inside our actions folder. We see that start login simply calls Firebase's sign in with pop-up function, which calls our pop-up login. Okay, so let's try logging in here with Google's Authenticator. There we go. It is now prompting me to type in my Google email and my password. Now, here we have our dashboard. And that's pretty much all that our login page does. And it uses the Redux Connect to connect our state and grab our start login function to use the dispatch. Next, let's take a look at the expenses dashboard. And you see here, the expenses dashboard simply outputs three different components: our summary, our list filters, and our list. So let's take a look at our summary first. Expenses summary, a very simple component that outputs a single sentence and a single button. We format a few things in this component. One thing is the word, the expenses word, to be either singular or plural, depending on the expenses count. And then the expenses total is also formatted using numeral, which is a JavaScript library for formatting numbers. Next up, I can say that here we have Redux, once again connecting our state to our component, our map state to props, is setting a visible expenses, grabbing that from this function, select expenses, being called in from our selectors file or our selectors expenses file. And what it does is it returns a list of expenses based on the filters. So let's take a look at that real fast. Expenses from our selectors. So let's go to this one. And we'll see here we have a component that takes in the expenses, takes in the different types of filters, and creates everything needed. For example, it creates the date variable out of the expenses date, created at date, and it tries to match it to see if it falls in the date range if that is one of the filters that was set. And by default, it does set a date range for the current month that you're in with the help of Moment, the other JavaScript library used for calendar type settings. So this component takes in the expenses, the filters, tries to match the expenses with the filters, and then sorts and returns the list with the new filters combined. Now, that was the summary, and that was the filters. Now let's go look at the expense list. The expense list is also another pretty simple and straightforward component. Just a few headers. If we go in here and add an expense, let's call this phone bill in the amount of $50. Let's say it's always due on the 15th. And random notes, we see here that there is these headers being outputted for both mobile and desktop. And down here, we're using a ternary operator to decide if we want to output either text that says no expenses to show, or the list of expenses. The way we're outputting the list of expenses is by mapping through each expense and then returning a expense list item component. Let's go take a look at that component real fast. So, expense list item. A very simple component that simply outputs the information given to it. Here we have the different variables that it is taking in and then using them to output the information we want. And here we are using moment and numeral once again to format our numbers that we want. So now we have our dashboard, expense summary, expense list filters, and we have gone through all those three, but we have not seen the add expense and the edit expense components. If I were to click on this button here, I am taken to a add expense, and I see here a form where I can save a new expense. Let's go take a look at that component. Here is the add expense component. Another simple and straightforward component that simply outputs the title and our form. And here underneath we have, again, Redux connecting our state to our component. Let's go take a look at the expense form. So here is our expense form. It's a very straightforward component. It has a onChange for pretty much every field. And inside the constructor, we see here it is putting together all of the different state fields that we're going to need. And this is necessary not for the add expense component, but for the edit expense component. And we'll see why in just a minute. Now, here we have this expense form outputting simply the form with the different fields that it uses. 2 inputs, 1 date picker, and a text area. each one having a variety of different attributes that it takes in order to do its job. For example, each one has an on change. So whenever you enter anything into one of the inputs or the text area, or you change the date, it automatically changes the state. As seen here, as anything changes, the state is set with the new value. Now, on submit, we can see here that it is calling the onSubmit. Inside of this onSubmit, it is calling the onSubmit that was passed in inside add expense page. Add expense page does pass in the onSubmit that is in here, passes it into the expense form. And the expense form then uses that one and passes in all the different information from the form. This onSubmit is calling start add expense, which is in one of our actions. If we take a look at that action, we see here start add expense. What it's doing is it's creating a user ID from our authentication, creating our expense data, and then pushing our new expense data to the database, and then dispatching our add expense reducer. Here, our add expense reducer is simply returning our state and our action. So that was add expense. Now let's take a look at edit expense. If I go back in my page here and I go take a look at this phone bill, I can see here when I click on phone bill, the same form pops up, but it is now populated by all of the information of the phone bill. The description, amount, date, I set it to the 15th, and the notes. And I have options to save any changes or delete the expense entirely. So let's take a look at this component. Edit expense page has on submit and on remove, both actions being taken by the buttons seen on the left here. It outputs a simple title and our form once again. This is the same form component that we took a look at a moment ago, but this time, instead of only taking an on submit, it also takes in the expense. In this case, we pass in the expense because we want to populate the form with the expense values in order to edit them. So once we go into expense form, we can now take a look at this constructor and see why this constructor is checking if there is an expense inside props value so that it can use the expense values for our state values. And this is how we populate this form in order to edit our expense data instead of just adding a new expense data. So now that we've taken a look at all of our components, let's take a look at our CSS. To start off, let's start with our Webpack config. In the Webpack config, we see here I am using SCSS as the CSS preprocessor. I am extracting from styles.css as seen here. Now, if we go to that file, let's go to styles.scss. We see the import of all of our different style sheets. If we go up into the styles folder, I'll see here two folders, one base and one components. Inside base, there is a base SCSS and a settings SCSS, both of which set up pretty much the base of our styling. Inside settings, I like to put in variables as seen here as an example that can be used throughout your project. And this can be very easy to help you theme your project. And for base, this is just base settings that live throughout your project. As for component style sheets, they are very specific to each component. Now let's take a look at our tests. Here we have a test for almost every single file. Here we can take a look at something like edit expense page, and we can see our different tests for it. I am using Enzyme in order to use shallow and match the snapshot to the wrapper created out of this shallow in order to test each different component and make sure that it's always outputting as intended. These tests are all using a fixed list of values down here. Here is one for a list of expenses and a list of filters. Now let's take a look at Firebase. If we look at our Firebase folder, our Firebase file, our configuration here is using variables from inside process.env and setting up our Google provider and database. .env.development and .env.test are both files that have inside of it the variables for or with the Firebase API key, auth domain, database URL, and all these lovely variables needed in order to use our Firebase database. And our git ignore. And last, but most certainly not least, let's take a look at our configuration for Redux. So let's take a look at config store. And here we have a very straightforward Redux store configuration using combine reducers to combine our expenses, filters, and authentication reducer. And that is allowing us, if I see here, I can go look at states and see our different state variables living inside Redux. And that is pretty much it for the Finansify web application. All of this was built using React. It was a very fun project, creating a more in-depth version pretty much of the to-do list, which is a very common application being used to learn React. And I thought it was very fun to create a much more in-depth version of this to-do list. And here it is. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you.